Welcome to Rabai's Story, where every tale is a gift, told under the rhythm of rain and the roar of thunder. Settle in, let the storm surround you, and let the story unfold. Enjoy the ride. It was the middle of summer when my wife Emma and I decided to leave the city. We were tired of the noise, the constant hum of traffic, the city's never-ending rush. Monroe seemed like the perfect escape, quiet, small, and hidden away from the madness. The house we found was a modest two-story with a white picket fence surrounded by trees. It had that cozy charm that you only find in small towns, a little worn around the edges, but it had character. We thought it was the perfect place to start fresh. The neighbors, when we first arrived, seemed friendly enough. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson across the street waved hello, while the Thompsons next door brought over a homemade pie. The town had that old-school neighborly vibe. Everyone knew each other, and everyone made sure you felt at home. But there was something odd about it all. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, it was just little things. The neighbors didn't talk much. No casual chit-chat, no inviting us over for dinner. They'd smile, wave, and go back inside. I thought maybe they were just shy. Maybe it was the heat. But after a few weeks, I began to notice more. One evening, as I was mowing the lawn, I saw Mrs. Wilson standing by her window. She wasn't moving, just staring out. It wasn't unusual to see people through their windows in small towns, but this felt different. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at anything, really just staring into space. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her lips were frozen in a thin, tight line. I waved, but she didn't react. It wasn't like she didn't see me. She had to have seen me, but she didn't wave back. She didn't even blink. That night, after dinner, I brought it up to Emma. She laughed, said I was imagining things. It's just a small town, babe. They're probably just private people. I wanted to believe her, but the next few days made me doubt that. I started noticing more and more strange behaviors. I'd see Mr. Thompson in his yard working on his garden, but whenever I walked past, he'd stop what he was doing and stare at me, like he was waiting for something, and the silence. It was the silence that bothered me the most. The town was quiet, sure, but there was no sound at all. No children playing, no cars honking, no barking dogs. It was as if the whole place had a lid on it, as if the very air was holding its breath. One evening, Emma and I decided to take a walk down the block. The air was thick with humidity, the street lamps flickering in the distance. As we walked, I noticed something else strange. The houses weren't just empty. They looked dead. The yards were well kept, but the windows were always shut tight, and there was no movement inside. No lights, no shadows, no life. We passed the Wilsons' house again. Mrs. Wilson was still standing at the window, but this time her hands were pressed against the glass. Her fingers splayed wide as if she was trying to reach out. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. I stopped dead in my tracks. "That's not right," I muttered under my breath. Emma turned to look at the window, but Mrs. Wilson was gone. The blinds had dropped down in an instant, as though she had never been there at all. "Maybe she was just adjusting the curtains," Emma said, trying to brush it off. But I couldn't. The feeling in my gut was growing stronger, the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the air too still. I decided to get some fresh air, hoping the cool night breeze would clear my head. I stepped outside onto the porch, the creaky wooden steps groaning beneath me. As I stood there, I heard something, a soft whisper, barely audible over the hum of the crickets. I strained my ears. It was coming from across the street, from the Wilsons' house. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, like a chant. My heart began to race. I stepped off the porch and moved closer, trying to stay in the shadows. The front door of the Wilson house was slightly ajar, a faint glow coming from inside. I couldn't resist. I moved up to the door and pushed it open, just a crack. Inside, I saw the strangest thing. The entire family, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, their two teenage kids, were standing in a circle in the living room. They weren't talking, but they were moving in sync, swaying back and forth like they were in a trance. Their eyes were wide open, but they didn't seem to be looking at anything. They were just there. Then, without warning, they all turned their heads in unison toward the door, their gazes locking on me. A chill ran down my spine. "Get out!" a voice hissed from within the house. It wasn't Mrs. Wilson. It wasn't any of them. The voice came from somewhere deeper, a low growl from the walls themselves. I backed away quickly, heart pounding in my chest. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran back to my house, bolting the door behind me. I stood there, breathless, listening for any sounds, the whispers, the footsteps, anything, but it was silent again, too silent. The next morning, I tried to forget what happened. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd imagined it. But when I went outside to check on the Wilsons' house, it was as if nothing had changed. The blinds were down. The yard was quiet. No sign of the strange ritual I had witnessed. That afternoon, I decided to go inside and confront Emma. But when I entered the living room, something was wrong. The room was dark, despite the daylight outside. The curtains were drawn, and there was a chill in the air. Emma was sitting on the couch, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. I rushed over to her. "Emma, what's wrong?" She didn't respond. That's when I saw it. The same look I had seen on the Wilsons' faces. The same blank expression. Her lips moved slightly, whispering something I couldn't understand. Then, in a low, cold voice, she said, "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to shake her awake, but she didn't move. The words lingered in the room, echoing like a warning. And I knew then, whatever the Wilsons were, whatever they had become, it was already too late for me. Monroe had already claimed us.